Okay, this is the final video of the week, and it has to do with the final packet, which is prose poems. I don't know if any of you have much experience reading or writing prose poems, maybe. There were a couple in the textbooks, so there's a section, I think, on page like 880 and 881 if you want a brief discussion and a couple of examples of prose poems. But it's very, very cursory, very short. And the prose poem is a real thing. It is out there. It's making the rounds in a way. It's very popular. And it's very weird. So I just sort of want to discuss that with you and talk about it, read a few of them, because there are a couple different views of the prose poem. So I'll read a couple, and we'll start with one by Mary Rueful. This is called On Twilight. It's from your packet. I read the poem of a student, and in the poem, God wandered through a room picking up random objects, a pear, a vase, a shoe, and in bewilderment said, "I made this?" Apparently God had forgotten making anything at all. I awarded this poem a prize because I was the judge of such matters. I was not really awarding the student, I was awarding God. I knew someday the student would pick up this old poem and say in bewilderment, "I made this?" And at the moment, his whole world would be lost in the twilight. And when you are finally lost in the twilight, you cannot judge anything. So, prose poem, not a poem, whatever, think about it. We'll come back to it a little bit later. So that's one. I mean, it's playing with logic, right? Which is something that I think a lot of prose poems are doing. So that's one vein that the prose poems sort of pursue. There are a couple other ones in your packet that are very different, right? In the Americans poems, you had a poem by James Wright. I think this is totally a James Wright poem. This is called Honey, and it's also one of my favorites, and I'll read that for you. Honey. My father died at the age of 80. One of the last things he did in his life was to call his 58-year-old son-in-law Honey. One afternoon in the early 1930s, when I bloodied my head by pitching over a wall at the bottom of a hill and believed that the mere sight of my own blood was the tragic meaning of life, I heard my father offer to murder his future son-in-law. His son-in-law is my brother-in-law, whose name is Paul. These two grown men rose above me and knew that a human life is murder. They weren't fighting about Paul's love for my sister. They were fighting with each other because one strong man, a factory worker, was laid off from his work, and the other strong man, the driver of a coal truck, was laid off from his work. They were both determined to live their lives, so they glared at each other and said they were going to live come hell or high water. High water is not trite in southern Ohio. Nothing is trite along a river. My father died a good death. To die a good death means to live one's life. I don't say a good life. I say a life. And another one by Robert Haas. And if you haven't read much of Robert Haas, you should do that. He's a killer poet. I think his prose poems are fantastic. This is probably one of my favorites. It's not probably, it is one of my favorites. It's from a book called Human Wishes, and it's called A Story About the Body. The young composer working that summer at an artist colony had watched her for a week. She was Japanese, a painter, almost 60, and he thought he was in love with her. He loved her work, and her work was like the way she moved her body, used her hands, looked at him directly when she made amused and considered answers to his questions. One night, walking back from a concert, they came to her door, and she turned to him and said, "I think you would like to have me." "I would like that too, but I must tell you I have had a double mastectomy. And when he didn't understand, I've lost both my breasts." The radiance that he had carried around in his belly and chest cavity, like music, withered very quickly, and he made himself look at her when he said, "I'm sorry, I don't think I could." He walked back to his own cabin through the pines, and in the morning he found a small blue bowl on the porch outside his door. It looked to be full of rose petals, but he found when he picked it up that the rose petals were on top. The rest of the bowl, she must have swept them from the corners of her studio, was full of dead bees. And then finally a couple by Russell Edson, who's kind of a trip and a half. It was an interesting encounter reading him for the first time, reading his book of poems called The Tunnel, which is sort of a selected poem, some of his best. So this is called A Child Walking Out of a Cow's Behind. A door would wish to swing out upon its hinges, but no one comes, said an old woman looking at a door with binoculars from a tree. A door is the difference between inside and out. A cow is eating a child. No, a child is passing behind a cow. One can see, one looks, yet one cannot see what is behind the door. I believe a cow is eating a child. No, a child is passing behind a cow. What if, Once on the other side of the door, there remains only the urgency to use the door again. Do my binoculars entitle me to know something? Were I a doctor, I would wish to swing out upon my hinges and allow my room to fill with what has come from the outside. Is that cow eating a child? Now I see a child walking out of a cow's behind. And last is the fall, and then we're going to talk about some of these things. And I don't read a whole lot of stuff to you. I don't want to bore you too much, but I think it's good, because there are two different styles here, and I just want to juxtapose them so we can talk about them in the video. The fall. There was a man who found 2 leaves and came indoors holding them out, saying to his parents he was a tree. To which they said, "Then go into the yard and do not grow in the living room, as your roots may ruin the carpet." He said, "I was fooling, I am not a tree," and he dropped his leaves. But his parents said, "Look, it is fall." So I think we got 2 different types of prose poems here. I think we have 2 different styles. So in one style I would place the James Wright and the Robert Haas poems, and then the other ones I would place the Mary Rueful and the Russell Edson poems. The Rueful and the Edson poems, they play a little bit more with logic, right? They're kind of circular, almost philosophical in a way. Edson's poems, they have dialogue. There aren't quotation marks, but you know that they're, we have characters speaking to each other. So does that automatically eliminate the possibility that it's a poem? Does it therefore make it a short story, like a very short story? What are the genre distinctions? If we look at the other way, there's a real emotional core to the Robert Haas and the James Wright poems, right? Those are they're killer poems. They make you hurt inside. A story about the body is brutal. And it's not flowery, it's not over dramatic, it's just, plain and spare, and it sort of kills you on the inside. It's a poem that gets me every single time. And so, I wonder, are these all prose poems? Is the prose poem genre big enough to fit all of these different styles, or to fit these 2 different styles? There are more styles than that. There are a bunch of different, maybe Mary Rueful's poems are not quite like Russell Edson's, so it's maybe unfair to lump them all together. But for our purposes, there are a couple different styles of prose poems, or, what is poetry? What is prose poetry? The final question, I think, in the discussion thread this week, it's the final week of poetry, is actually defining in your own terms what poetry is. Or maybe what poetry is not. I'm reading this book by Leo Tolstoy. It's called What is Art? And I find his definition of art really lame, but I find his explanations of what art is not really great. So maybe you want to talk about maybe not what poetry is, but what poetry is not. Maybe we can talk about what the prose poem is not instead of what it is. But I've got a few quotes from different people talking about the prose poem genre and the genre distinctions in general. So I got them on a PowerPoint. I'll pull them up for you real quick. So this is summer. So in fall of last year, I gave a talk on genre distinctions, basically between short fiction and prose poetry. Excuse me. And because I'm really, I sort of studied writing poetry, and then I've by accident wrote a few very short stories, and I started writing longer short stories, and what is the difference between a poem or not a poem, and there are small chunks of text that are called prose poems, and there are small chunks of text the exact same length and shape that are called short stories. And so you can't just tell by looking at it, right? A regular poem, if it's broken into lines, you can sort of tell. Well, all things being equal, I'm going to call this a poem because it just looks like a poem. But when you just look at a chunk of prose, it can be anything. It could be a prose poem, it could be a piece of flash fiction. And so, what's the difference? And if you can read this, I'll at least read it for you. I bought a couple of books that were useful in my research, and they're the Field Guide to Writing, or the Field Guide to Prose Poetry and the Field Guide to Flash Fiction, and they're basically essays and interviews trying to define these terms for us. And this is something from the introduction. So the editors were writing this, and they say, "We feel that the very term, the prose poem, has come to define a small, justified block of writing wherein weird shit happens." Their words, not mine, right? So you can all write to your deans. When you complain, I'll just say, these are their words, not mine. But the prose poem is a place where weird shit happens. And I think we kind of see that in the Mary Rueful poem. We definitely see that in the Thomas Edison, Russell Edson poems, right? Weird things are happening. It's a very strange world. If you read other ones, they're like, there's a family sitting down to dinner and they're eating an ape. And then there's a poem where they're sitting down to dinner, I think, with an ape. And all sorts of, they're almost surreal, okay? So if you have a chunk of text and you don't know whether it's a short story or a prose poem. Maybe if it's full of weird shit happening, then you call it a prose poem. But that's not really a satisfactory definition, right? Do I have that slide? We got my dictionary of poetic terms here. Do they define a prose poem? I don't think they do, because I put it in the slide in my presentation for the talk last semester, and it doesn't give a satisfactory definition of what poetry is or what prose poetry is either. So, is it a place where weird shit happens? Well, I mean, if we look at the James Wright and the Robert Haas poems, I think they would differ. And in fact, Robert Haas has gone on the record saying, I don't think that the prose poem is a place where you have to have all of this weird stuff happening. It's not a surrealist type of genre. It's a place for you to get at a real emotional core in a different way. And so, I respect both of the poets. They have different views. So, who am I to decide? Who are us to decide? But it's interesting to think about. Here is Lydia Davis, who's a killer writer. She writes mostly short fiction, like very, very short fiction. Some of her stories are like 1 or 2 sentences long. And damn, I just don't think you can read this, but I'll read it out for you. This is from an interview that she did with actually a poet who writes prose poems. So it's a poet who writes a lot of prose poems, asking her about the distinction between prose poems and short stories and fables and all sorts of things. So Lydia Davis says, I was simply reacting against Edson's designation of his pieces as poems, so he calls them poems, which I have seen on the covers of his collections more often than prose poems or fables. They've also been called fables. I might call them fables, except that this term usually implies a moral or a precept, and I think his pieces are wonderfully free of morals. They are stories for me because they are full of narrative. The weight of emphasis in them is on the narrative, I think, not on the language. When the emphasis shifts to the language, then maybe they enter the realm of a poem. So we talked about having, Edson's poems, they have characters who are speaking to each other, and there seems to be a story developing, right? So according to Lydia Davis, she thinks that if you have, what's foremost in the mind of the piece of literature? Is it an attention to language, or is it an attention to the development of the narrative? And she thinks that Edson is more interested in developing the narrative, and so she would call them stories or fables maybe, but not call them poems. And these are both like accomplished writers, and they're disagreeing with each other, and that's fine. It makes life sort of interesting for us literature students. This is Mary Rueful. So the poems that I gave you for Mary Rueful are from this book called The Most of It. I don't know if you can see that. And where's that slide? I don't know if you can see this, but I've got a slide up of the back of her book. You might be able to see it better than the actual real thing. So down here, if you're all familiar with what a book looks like, you've got your front cover, this is the back cover, you've got the ISBN number, and then what it's categorized as. And it's listed as poetry, even though this book won a prize for lyric essays. And so this is an excerpt from an interview Mary Rueful gave to the foundation that gave her the prize for writing lyric essays, even though the book is marketed as poetry. So she's going to talk a little bit about the genre distinctions. So this is Mary Rueful. To tell the truth, I am a little tired of the genre wars, more than a little. Lines between genres have been breaking down for at least half a century. And though I understand an older person being baffled and uncertain, perhaps the world is falling apart, it surprises me when young people who were basically born into the postmodern world, which I wasn't, keep asking questions. I would think they would take the slippage between genres for granted. And I think that's kind of interesting. I don't know. I wouldn't say I'm the generation of Mary Rueful. I'm not quite maybe in your generation either, but I'm somewhere in the middle. And this is an online class, right? So we're talking about mixed media. So isn't it natural that we're going to be mixing literary genres together too? You're taking an online class. It has text. It also has video. It has all sorts of stuff. I gave you a couple sound clips from, I think, James Wright and Donald Hall for this week, so you can listen to them reading their own poetry. So it's a multimedia type of world. And Mary Rueful saying, well, if this is kind of the nature of the world, again, it's sort of a sociological question, but if this is the nature of the world, doesn't it just make sense that the nature of our literature is going to change and we're going to have multi-genre literature? and just like we sort of have multimedia types of information and experiences. So I find that kind of interesting. And here's a little funny anecdote from Mary Rueful, talking about one of her early publishing experiences. This is a true story. When I was 22 years old, I sent my first submission to a magazine. I thought I was sending a short story. The reply came back. Dear Miss Rueful, we are terribly sorry, but we don't publish poetry. I thought about it for a long time, and I resubmitted the piece to a poetry journal, and they accepted it. It was my first publication, and I never looked back. So I think that's all I've got for the slides here. So I'll just open it up to you guys. What do you think is, are these pieces prose poems? What is a prose poem? What is poetry? These are things that we can discuss in the thread this week, and I would really love for all of you to weigh in on that. And again, you don't have to define what poetry is. Maybe we can talk about what it is not. But this is something I'm the instructor for this class. I can't tell you what poetry is, or even what prose poetry is, or what it is not. I think the lines are really fuzzy in places. So let's have that discussion in the discussion thread, and that will be a nice conclusion to our unit on poetry. So maybe you would think it makes sense to define poetry at the front end, but I think having read a lot of poems, this is a good place to say, these are the qualities that I think poems have, and these are the qualities that I don't have. So now that we've got that in our rear view, we can assess that and try to make a conclusion of what poetry really is. And maybe that'll be a nice way of ending the unit.